Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Top of the morning, Josh.
Top of the morning to you.
So we are not in the studio today. We're recording remotely just to be COVID safe. We're both healthy, but one of us, me, was exposed to COVID over the weekend. So we're trying to keep it reasonable here. We spend most of the time, in particular, in a very relatively narrow sense, I think, in the last few sessions, looking closely at the internals of Texas politics, if you will. And look, there's a lot going on this week that we could call attention to, and a lot of this has happened, fairly recently. Campaign finance reports are out for Texas races. Department of Justice report on Uvalde is being released, I believe, as we are recording this on Thursday at 11. That highly critical, not surprisingly, of the response. Calling all Reds congressional vote for a resolution condemning the Biden administration's handling of the border, ongoing border negotiations in Congress. So there's plenty going on, and I've left a few things out probably stateside, but I think some of these things are going to come up. I thought we should do today is, in the wake of Iowa and just given the timing of where we are in the political calendar, I want to go with one of the big external factors that, are in play in Texas elections, mixture of the direct and the indirect, maybe, that we'll unpack. And that is, the presence of Donald Trump in Texas. Now, before we get underway with that, I do want to point out a post that a couple of pieces actually that we posted at the Texas Politics Project website that rounds up data from the 6 polls that we conducted in 2023. The most recently posted piece looks at data in 9 or so areas that provide context for the 2024 election, and the Trump discussion we're kind of set up to have today as part of that. And then we have another piece that drills down much further on kind of the interplay between Texans' judgments of what the legislature undertook in 2023, and they undertook it all year, and their expectations of how well the legislature did, how that kind of plays into primary politics, state politics, et cetera. Both of those pieces, if you go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu, you can follow the blog link, and they'll be near the top of that list, depending on when you go. So with that set up today, with the election clearly underway, we did think that it was a good time to take stock of one of the big external factors shaping the election, Donald Trump, and the election in Texas, and Trump's presence in the Texas political universe. Now, as we've gone back and forth talking about this a little bit pre-production and chatting back and forth and looking at what we had, I think, like almost anything to do with Donald Trump, unpacking this involves looking at things that are, very, kind of simple and maybe obvious and complex, and things that are a little more complex and maybe not so obvious. So, on the heels of Trump's big win in Iowa, which, despite all the coverage leading in, a whole topic unto itself, I don't think anybody was particularly surprised by that outcome. Certainly, I don't think you were, Josh, and Not that Iowa and Texas are the same, but, I think we can start by looking at the early presidential primary trial ballot numbers in our December poll, which look not unlike the Iowa outcome, not unlike what we're seeing nationally. The only thing really that looks particularly different is New Hampshire, the New Hampshire polling, and we can talk about that. And I would still argue that New Hampshire polling is different in degree, but, we'll see how that shakes out. I mean, I think that's all about right. I mean, I don't think there's anything too controversial in that.
Yeah, I mean, the New Hampshire issue just has to do with the curious nature of their primary process and, the added difficulty of gaming out what the primary electorate there is actually going to look like, in particular, how, what share of that electorate is actually going to be made up of non-Republicans. And I think if you go look at the polling among Republicans there, you're going to see pretty similar numbers there to what you saw in Iowa and what you're seeing nationally and what you're seeing in the Texas poll. So what we saw, going back to our December poll conducted at the end of last year, was we saw 65% of, potential Republican primary voters say that they would be supporting Trump in the 2024 Texas primary election. Similar to what we're seeing both in polling and in reality, it leads to him trouncing his nearest opponent, which at the time of our polling was Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He received the support of only 12% of voters in that December survey. I think some more recent polling that may have come out even today shows Trump with similar levels of support, although it looks like Haley and DeSantis flip in that polling, but they're still sitting at about, I think Haley's at about 11% there and Trump's at about 69%. So again, all within the same ballpark here. I think what's notable, about that in some ways, and this is, so we sort of talk about this and we say it's notable and it's not. Sometimes we joke, if 90% of people think something, then there's no group where it's like, well, only 20% think this.
Yeah, and when you're in the high 60s, that's still pretty close.
Yeah,
mid to high 60s.
Yeah,
same dynamic is at work. Yeah,
right. Math kind of works that way. So with that strong showing overall, Trump is dominating most of the groups that we think are going to make up the primary electorate in Texas. So 80% of those who identify as strong Republicans say they're going to support Trump. 69% who identify as conservative. Amongst those who identify as extremely conservative, it goes up to 76%. Another sort of core group in the GOP constituency, especially here, is sort of biblical literalists. Some very religious voters. 71% of those say that they're going to be supporting Trump. But even when we look at sort of the groups that we think of as maybe being potential sources of exposure for Trump or weaknesses in the coalition, even here he's still running, fairly, if not very strong, right? So 56% of moderates, which, there's not a huge share of the GOP coalition, but still a majority of the moderates in the GOP coalition say that they are going to be supporting Trump.
And we should say that the universe here was, we asked people what primary election, if they were going to vote in the Republican primary.
Right. So this is an all moderates, but the idea is if you're a moderate who plans to participate in the Republican primary, odds are that you're not going there to take Trump out. Actually, odds are just barely that you're there to support him. Right.
Right.
When we look at the less strongly attached Republicans, those who initially identify as independents, but then when pushed say, well, I'm a Republican, who will be voting the primary again. Half say they'll be voting for Trump. Even we look at kind of the groups we think of as maybe up for grabs. 63% of suburban Republican primary voters say that they're going to be supporting Trump.
Yeah, I think, as we were digging up some of the notes for this, I think that's a number to come back to. Yeah. It's one to put in the pocket in terms of talking about, the battle in the suburbs. Now, look, if you're a Democrat, you could say, yeah, well, it's not like a rural area where it's, whatever, 85 or 90. But it speaks that's to a big number.
But it speaks to what, like something you kind of put a pin in up a little bit above, which is, the press's coverage of this, and look, I don't know if it's fair or unfair. And I'm not, I'm not crapping on the press on this one. It kind of is what it is. You have to cover Iowa. It is what it is. It's a news event, regardless of whether the outcome is pretty predictable or not. It's notable that this was probably the least interesting Iowa, at least in my lifetime, in terms of just, actually kind of looking at it and sort of thinking about the result. Even over the trajectory of how people interpret Iowa results as being either super important or not important at all or anywhere in between.
Yeah, for comparison, Ted Cruz narrowly won last time.
Yeah, President. Oh, right. No. So that's the thing. I mean, it is what it is, but nonetheless,
I should correct myself. Not last time, in 2016.
Right, in 2016. And so, the last time there was a competitive Iowa caucus for Republicans. We could say.
I was right-ish.
You're right enough. Post-truth world we live in. But the idea is the same thing. Is that I think there's this there is a tendency to say, okay, well, you want to make more out of this. So you say, well, yeah, hey, so Trump's strong, but like maybe he's not so strong with these people, or who is Haley strong with, or who is DeSantis strong with, and you start to try to look in these numbers for potential sources of weakness, whether out of desire, curiosity, whatever. And the point is that like if you've been doing this, you would say, boy, it doesn't really exist. And I think, part of the polling, that kind of, I think, elucidates some of this is that none of this should be really surprising given sort of the longer term trajectory of views of Trump, both nationally, but also in Texas. And we look among Texas Republicans, the most recent poll found 80% saying that they had a favorable view of Donald Trump. This is, I would say, very much on the trend line, for Trump post-presidency. And so there's no situation, we looked at this, after January 6th, in the aftermath, throughout the legal drama and the trouble, which they are very aware of, people are hearing a lot about, views of Trump have not shifted within the Republican electorate. And so really, in some ways, he's underperforming his favorability a little bit, which actually shows, he has room to grow. It's not as though, it's not as though the 63% is necessarily a ceiling for him, nor does this mean that, the other 38% of Republican, primary voters aren't going to show up for Trump come November, because there's overwhelmingly positive views of him. Now, look, that doesn't mean he doesn't remain, insanely divisive along party lines here as elsewhere. But, overall, sort of sitting there at, 46, 45, unfavored with the Texas electorate overall, but with 80% of Republicans holding a favorable view of him, pretty comfortable place to be.
Yeah, and remember that, in terms of the way this race is looking right now, if you flip that and look at Joe Biden's favorabilities among Republicans, he's 77% very unfavorable.
Right.
Now, I think that, look, in Texas, that's not, that is what it is. I think it does raise the question, and this kind of jumps ahead a little bit, but, about just how much minor bits of attrition in Trump's numbers, should that happen? And we've seen that in a couple of windows where, I was looking at the trend in those favorability ratings. Where he was in December is about right, as you say, implied, is like right in the middle of where he's been. It's kind of, I'll bet the average is pretty close to 80.
Yeah.
Because I think he's moved between about, low to mid 70s and low to mid 80s.
Well, that's the point. He's never dropped.
I think his high point was maybe 85 at some point.
Yeah, and he's never dropped below 71 or 72 or anything like that.
Right. So, he's, and I guess that, that does, in terms of thinking about the national election, before we get to thinking about what it means internally in Texas, national, this question is out there, is that, small bits of attrition could hurt him in competitive states, in the state, the 6 or 7, maybe it's 8 real competitive states that people are swing states that people are looking at. But sorting out, his, the Trump-Biden dynamic and negative partisanship and all these, a lot of the usual suspects. I think it's a as we were going back and forth in chat, I think it's a super open question. It's hard to imagine that Trump is not somewhat vulnerable, given all the jeopardy he's in legally.
Yeah.
To minor fluctuations, minor attrition, that small attrition in these competitive states could tell the tale.
Yeah, and I think it's true for Biden also. To be fair here, right?
But that's the other shoe, right?
This is a weird election, blah, 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 for a lot of reasons. And I think, there's the obvious reasons it's kind of a weird election having to do with, sort of Trump's, whatever you want to call it, norm busting, Biden's age. Whatever, all those things all play. We're still, I think one thing that I think we're kind of failing to appreciate, I'm just going to say this right now, but we're still coming out of the pandemic. That sort of sounds crazy, but it's not, because we're still dealing with the economic consequences of it, and even a lot of the social, cultural consequences of it. And so we're still in a strange place. Having said that, when I said that it's weird, I think it's weird in sort of a different way, which is, normally, we think about these elections in terms of persuasion versus mobilization is like a classic kind of concept to kind of frame how you think about it.
Right.
And often we think about the mobilization of partisans, and in some ways, in the inverse, we are talking about the mobilization of base partisans. How is Biden going to do well enough with black Democrats? Is Trump going to do well enough with suburban Republicans, and so on and so forth? But in some ways, it's almost like that's not really what we're talking about here. We're really talking about attrition. It's like, it's not persuasion, it's not mobilization, it's questions of attrition. It's, can Biden shore up, his progressive base after, issues going on with, the Israel-Gaza conflict, for example, and issues going on with the border.
Yeah, if they make a deal, they clearly badly want to make a deal on immigration, and we'll come to that. But
right.
that is not the favored move of the progressive wing of the party.
Yeah, and so Biden in some ways is trying to figure out how he can manage his own attrition issues, and Trump in some ways has attrition issues that are I don't think anybody's trying to manage, and if anything are being papered over a lot, which is maybe why we talk about it more. But in some ways, the math is almost, it's sort of, we talk about this sometimes, like social science math is tricky because really like the question isn't, is Biden going to have, 85 or 90% of African Americans voting for him? There's that sort of question, but it's almost like, is he going to lose 0% of core, Democratic, let's say, voters under 30, or is he going to lose 5%? And so we're kind of looking at these small numbers and the collection of them, I think, in some ways across the electorate. And look, right now it's impossible. You can't know because these are all estimates of subgroups a year out. I know that after the election, it'll be really easy for people to look back and say, this is what happened here, right? Sure. We can't do that yet. But,
and how wrong all the polls were.
And how wrong all the polls were that we're going to use to analyze what happened. Don't ask me. But I do think that this is sort of an interesting kind of unique moment where you're both looking at both candidates in some sort of ways and saying, okay, so like, what if Trump loses, what if Trump underperforms by 4% with Republican women this time around compared to last time? That alone might not make a big difference. But when you think about the competitiveness of these handful of battleground states, especially, this is where it makes a difference. When you're talking about differences of, a couple thousand votes here or a couple hundred votes here or there, then all of a sudden, a turnout rate, 2 points below the target kind of makes a big difference. But it's hard to tell a story like that in the lead up to the election.
Well,
as opposed to looking at these big, large groups of voters and say, oh, this is where evangelical Republicans came around for Trump. You're talking about the fat part of the distribution. You're not talking about the small share who's like, maybe not for me.
Right. Well, and I think just to add a small, data point on that, since we talked about the Trump trend, the Biden trend in job approval in Texas, is not great. He's, he's been at basically 75 in our last three polls approval among Democrats. Mm-hmm. And that's, on the low end of where he's been, right? Not, in no way should anybody look at these numbers and say, oh, Biden's support among Texas Democrats has collapsed. It is not saying that. But, if you basically take out the first, say, 6 months, the first four polls that we did between February and June of 2021, which was, pandemic response, early period Biden honeymoon, all these things, where his approval among Democrats and, lingering euphoria over the fact that Trump was gone among Democrats, his job approval is 89, 87, 88, 88 in those four polls.
Yeah.
He hasn't been above 80 since June of 2021, though, at or above 80. And he's been, well, that's not true. I guess he had a little burst in late 22, early 23 after the election. But he's been in the mid 70s mostly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's sort of, and I don't know whether this is true or not, in terms of this instance of it, but like this is also a pattern that like we've become pretty used to, right?
Yeah.
Both in the main in the sense of the honeymoon period and its eventual wearing off, but also even in the internals of that, like we're sort of looking at just approval overall. Ultimately, governing is hard. We've said this multiple times. You ultimately have to make decisions. As I think I love, Obama's take on this. Like nobody brings like a set of good decisions to the president to decide, what great thing he gets to do. It's usually the worst decisions. And so whether you're Trump, whether you're Obama, whether you're Biden, whether you're Bush, you end up making a lot of decisions that are going to make people unhappy, including people unhappy in your party. And so when we break those numbers down, what you tend to find is that like Democratic distaste or dislike or unfavorable ratings for Trump are through the roof, and they're extreme. So most Democrats hold very unfavorable views of Trump. Asked, whether they have a favorable view of Biden or whether they approve of how he's doing, the positive views generally split between the most favorable and then the next most favorable category, because again, governing is challenging, right? And so I think, we're at a point where there is a lot of this being sort of, drummed up in part of the lead up to sort of the campaign year and campaign coverage to say, oh my God, look how weak Biden is. And I think there's some truth to that for sure. And a lot of that has to do with sort of these other macro, external factors as well. But also it's just like, this is the pattern. This is what happens. And this is what happens before you get into a campaign where all of a sudden, those Democrats who may be like, well, I don't know if Biden's taking on inflation strongly enough. And you say, well, you going to vote for Trump?
Yeah.
No chance. So let's just, we got, there's a certain period that needs to happen where this sort of stuff needs to, congeal in some kind of way that really just hasn't yet. And anything I think that's sort of going too far down this line is like looking at data in January is like, it's useful and it's instructive. And I think trend data is obviously a lot more instructive because it can tell us what's sort of real versus ephemeral, what's durable in these attitudes. However, there's still a little ways to go here.
Yeah. And I think, as we know, the patterns related to partisan political attitudes and how partisanship affects voting behavior have yet to set in.
Exactly.
We're in the primary season. In fact, we're in the opposite part. We're at the place where divisions are most likely and doubts are most likely to express themselves. Mm-hmm. That said, in terms of where Trump stands, I was interested to see in the Iowa exit polls, and I was looking at the Washington Post, the ones the Washington Post posted, and I think there's a couple of different variances. But nonetheless, the exit polls show evidence of very similar patterns that we're seeing in Texas in terms of what we might think of as some of the Trump offsets or qualifications. And that is, kind of widespread indifference to Trump's legal issues. I mean, widespread awareness of them matched by widespread indifference, and the continuing rejection of the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election.
Yeah, right. I mean, our October 23 poll, when we last asked about this, found, basically just about 2/3 of Republican voters disagreeing with the proposition that protesters who entered the U.S. Capitol on January 6th were trying to overturn the election. 62%, same amount, said that, Joe Biden was not legitimately elected in 2020. And then, kind of going to the aftermath, or at least partial aftermath, asked in sort of August polling of last year about 4 different sets of criminal charges that Trump is facing. At least 70% of the GOP voters, and really much closer to 80 or 85%, viewed each of those charges as politically motivated.
Right. What we mean by that is we polled in that poll, we broke out different legal problems to see if there was much variance. And there's a little bit, but not...
Not much.
Not enough to really, make a difference. I mean, it was interesting. I think so.
Well, we wanted to make sure. I mean,
These
are the sort of questions pollsters discuss all the time. It's sort of, do we just want to take a blanket approach to sort of the criminal issue, that puts in quotes, the criminal, criminal investigations Donald Trump is facing? But honestly, they're different, right? And so we do want to add, and they're not only are they different, but we know from the polling that people are hearing a lot about them. So it's actually worthwhile to ask about the campaign finance violations versus the document issues versus the overturning of the election. Those are different sets of issues.
Yeah, and the big takeaway there, was that obviously it didn't make much of a difference in Iowa.
No.
And, it doesn't look like it's making much of a difference here. And I think, that carries over then into... how we see Trump as a figure in Texas politics, and I both in terms of the election, but also in terms of the general kind of attitudinal orientation and the, for lack of a better term, the mood of Texas Republicans vis-a-vis these kinds of issues. Because I think, we've dined out a lot, or we've kind of staked out a position in the podcast and in writing that, Ken Paxton hoped to benefit and to be seen as a Donald Trump-like figure, and that we're not seeing him elevated in that sense, given his approval numbers. On the other hand, it's hard for me not to feel like, Donald Trump's long-term effort to undermine people's, voters, in particular Republican voters, belief that the justice system and the criminal justice system are legitimate and can be trusted, almost certainly has helped Paxton among Republicans.
Yeah,
I don't have, I can't point to anything that says aha on that, I don't think, other than what we've already laid out there. But I think every time, Ken Paxton's, loses some motion in court or gets impeached, I think it's pretty plausible to say that when he says, the House is, illegitimate, or the courts are crooked, or, this is just a political vendetta by this judicial actor or that judicial actor, that the ground has not been pretty well plowed for that to be accepted by Republican voters.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's like a fine.
I don't want to go too far with that, but I think it's right.
No, there's a fine. I agree with you, but I think there's
just because the alternate explanation doesn't make any sense. That people would go, oh yeah, these things are totally different.
Yeah,
we see no evidence that that's happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's just a very tiny, fine distinction to make within that, which is to say, to the extent that when Ken Paxton says, hey, the judicial system is biased against Republicans, conservatives, me, whatever it is, the ground is fertile for those types of arguments, right? And so, because Trump has made it so fertile for those types of arguments, it doesn't mean that people wholeheartedly, agree with it. It doesn't mean that people necessarily wholeheartedly have like a strong, robust, built-out sort of sense of why this is the case, but it sounds familiar.
Right.
And in and of itself, if it sounds familiar, then it sounds plausible, and that sort of makes that work. Now, at the same time, that sounding plausible and sort of, making that an acceptable argument on the one hand doesn't translate so well to the other piece of sort of Trump's approach to this, which is to say that, essentially support for him, support for his version of events, his narrative becomes the litmus test for Republicans. And because the litmus test for Republican candidates in particular. And Paxton's ability to take sort of, general distrust of institutions, systems, the legal system in general, and turn it into, sort of a background set piece.
It doesn't automatically make him the champion of that.
No.
To the extent that you think of that as a cause, it doesn't make Paxton the automatic champion of that cause in the way that, people, a lot of Republicans do seem to have accepted Trump as the champion of that cause.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, and in Trump's case, it's really at the service of something else, which is, him,
Period.
Again, just at the service of him, and whereas, for Paxton, the idea that this is sort of, it's a bank shot. We say, okay, we can't trust the system. So therefore what's going on to me is unfair. So therefore it's like, and Trump is such we're kind of jumping around in some of the discussion points here, but, I think one of the things that Trump has done really well in some ways, we talk about this idea of repeated games, often in this podcast. Right. And it's another sort of game theory, IR kind of concept, is the idea of a credible threat. Well, Trump is an incredibly credible actor when it comes to threatening and following through with Republican elected officials who don't toe his line, right? And so because of that, it doesn't matter whether you are a governor, a state senator, a state rep, a congressperson. You could be the county commissioner. You could, use the old saw. You could be the GOP dog catcher. But none of those people are going to say, maybe Trump should have told those protesters to cool it earlier, or, maybe I would have not handled classified documents that way. Even the lightest sort of even seeming passing, glancing criticism is very likely to have Trump
respond with massive retaliation.
Yeah,
as long as we're talking about international relations.
Yeah, and that's a credible threat, and it's a repeated game, and they know this. And Paxton right now, going into these Republican primaries, a lot of the question in Texas is the extent to which he is going to be effective at weighing in on these primaries against Republicans who voted for his impeachment, and setting aside resource considerations on it. Let's just it's not as credible of a threat. It's already being presented. Yeah. That's already clear, regardless of what happens.
Right.
And so it's just a different thing, right? But at the same time, now going back to the overarching piece of this, but Trump's, persistence and consistency in being, a credible threatening force means that he really does hold sway over sort of the policy and the actions of Republican elected officials here in Texas in a way that's really outsized and remarkable.
Yeah, and look, we were talking beforehand, and you were making, sort of making the case that, there's lots of reasons that Republicans, in their own self-interest, might be concerned, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
And you're hearing this, look, you heard this from, but look, just to jump to that, you make the argument, but the argument has been made by some people. One can say that it was the wrong vehicle if you're thinking about somebody like Chris Christie or Asa Hutchinson. But this is out there,
yeah.
Right? In terms of, the list of things that might concern you, just in terms of, strict political self-interest as a candidate.
Yeah, it's really striking at this moment in the sense that, like the Democrats right now are just hemming and hawing about Biden like crazy. The number of articles in the New York Times about, these internal discussions amongst, Democratic, important Democratic officials about the campaign strategy or not of Biden,
Right.
Biden's age and Israel and the border and all these things.
Right up to Barack Obama. This was news last week or the week before. Having a phone call, having a conversation with Joe Biden in which he voiced his concerns.
Right, and yet there's outside of sort of the Chris Christie's of the world who've really been pushed really to the fringes of the GOP. There doesn't really seem to be, at least apparently, very much concern among Republicans about Trump's candidacy, despite clear reasons for it. Now, again, part of this is because of what we talked about. There's a chokehold here. You can't really voice these things lest you be punished. But just to point it out loud, he's lost 2 national elections. This is, again, just the popular vote in last 2 elections he was in, he lost. Also, in terms of the last 2 elections he was part of, besides 2016, lost a lot of seats. Didn't really maintain a majority very well. And then I think the thing that I would be most worried about, I think among, if you're thinking about sort of what Republicans should be most worried about is he hasn't really done anything to expand his appeal since he left office. And if anything, he's done a lot to really insulate himself within some of the more fringe elements of his party that he was really kind of, trying to keep something of an arm's length with, sort of think about the Proud Boys comment and that kind of stuff. And you go from that to sort of embracing, just clearly Nazi-like rhetoric with respect to America's blood and things like this. This is not necessarily the rhetoric or the approach of someone who's looking to expand their appeal. I would be worried about that, if I were a Republican voter, going into 2024, those twin factors.
Right.
But it's sort of but because of, again, the stranglehold that Trump has, almost no one is willing to give voice to this consideration.
Well, the other interesting thing about Trump on that too is, the one place where I would say, well, he is showing a more conventional kind of move in that direction, and I think if it's consistent with what he thinks, frankly, is the way he's trying to split the difference on abortion.
Well, like that, he's in that way, he's like every other Republican, right?
Yeah, right. But as the guy that's sending the most powerful signals, it's been an interesting dynamic to watch that.
Yeah, but I think that also sort of raises this other kind of, sort of broad sort of Trump-related effect on the political system in Texas and elsewhere, which is sort of, it does raise questions about sort of the strength of the party going forward. So one, you think more just pragmatically, what happens when Trump, either exits the field, goes to jail, dies. It's not, I think one of the things that this Republican primary has made clear is it's not really easy to beat Trump. Right, in the sense that I think there were other candidates who thought, well, I can beat Trump, but without this bad part, or I can talk like Trump. And so far, no one has really proven that. Yeah, okay.
It's not that easy to occupy the Trump space, right?
It's not easy.
That's kind of the DeSantis story.
That is the DeSantis story, as far as I'm concerned. It just wasn't possible. So on the one hand, there's this question of what happens to the party when this really huge animating force is no longer the animating force. But then the thing that I also think about as someone politically science oriented is and what and I guess I don't know how to phrase this, but sort of, what's the role of ideology and all that? And I raise that because you brought up the abortion issue as an interesting sort of piece of this. And, and we've talked, on this podcast a couple times, and I think we've sort of pawed at it, and we keep talking about how we might want to try to get at this question better. But I mean, I think, pinning down the nature of ideology and what it means to be conservative in the Republican Party at this point in time is becoming increasingly difficult and complicated. And part of that complexity really, in a lot of ways, is traced back to Trump, right? Who's really made it, in a lot of ways, a party about him. Now, again, he definitely has a set of issues that are a big part of his appeal. So I'm not going to say it's, devoid of, policy desires and things like that, and something, like an ideology. But it's not the ideology, I think, that, Republicans have sort of relied on, in the last 20 or 30 years as sort of a touchstone from which to move from.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of that. And I think, we still, Trump is so, there's such a personalism to Trump's appeal. Not that it's not, in a fairly identifiable ideological space, but that's not the heart of his appeal,
right?
Rhetorically, or however you want to, whatever spaces you construct, right? I mean, Trump will call Trump will call names that are call people names and insult them, and try to hurt them using that kind of insult. I mean, this was probably scripted for him by somebody in Texas, but, for example, when he referred to Dave Phelan as a rhino, right? I mean, but Trump does not stand up very frequently, other than, in terms of, a narrow-casted argument, and say, I am the true conservative very often, or I am the person who will save conservatism. It's just not. He leaves that to other people to do, and he gives people the work to do. As you mentioned, abortion. I mean, his splitting the difference on abortion is, something along the lines of, here I gave you, I gave you the court. The rest, I've done my bit.
Well, and I mean, interesting. I'm just thinking about now. I mean, going back to his last period, in the presidency. I mean, the idea was he had to add Mike Pence to the ticket to give him credibility with, some of the most conservative voters, with evangelicals.
Right.
And I don't think there's any obviously Pence is not going to be VP.
Right.
But I don't think that that's even like the tenor of the discussion at this point. I don't think.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen it. I don't know if it's come out yet, but the Jonathan Martin from Politico has a thing about has a column that came out this morning about the vice presidential race. And, one of the things that struck me was, I think that was contained in that article, this kind of like, Donald, if there's anything you saw in the Iowa exit polls and in the overall results, it's that Donald Trump has made the sale to evangelicals. And there's a big New York Times piece on this, I think last week or the week before. But the other thing that was interesting about that is how similar the parsing out of, different vice presidential candidates and the logic for the choice that Trump himself would make. And there's always, it's a cottage industry in election years, to talk about why vice presidents get picked and not picked or whatever. But it's really similar to things that we've been talking about. I mean, it really highlights some of the things that we've been talking about in Texas that are in one of the pieces we posted. And we made reference to the Texas Monthly piece, on, the internal fights in the Republican Party, that, ideology is operative, it's important, but there's a lot of other things going on. And there's a lot of other things going on in Trump's choice of a vice presidential candidate. Just like there are a lot of other things going on in looking at, various conflicts and races that in Texas that we've talked about. Trump is the great disruptor of that nationally. And I think that is having an effect in Texas. And I think when we think about that point you were making about Trump and the national party, that is manifesting in Texas, but it's manifesting in conjunction with, the dynamic that we've talked about a lot, which is that, Republicans are basically left most of the time to hash things out among themselves.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's not, And so, Trump just, I think throws jet fuel on that dynamic in Texas. Mm-hmm. He's not the main source of it here, I don't think. You can't really understand it without his presence and what he's activated. But, he's a factor in that, but it goes back to a point that we've made while Trump was president, or maybe even while he was still running, that, the raw materials of what, Trump himself and Trump's opponents and Democrats now call kind of the MAGA, the MAGA tendency in politics. All those raw materials were pretty active and already kind of in play in Texas before Trump even entered the stage. He catalyzed and mobilized that stuff and basically kind of stepped over Ted Cruz in adopting the most ideological and the most combative elements of that.
Yeah, and in doing so, I think, to your point, there's a lot more going on in each of these elections. But what's interesting is that, to the extent there's a lot more going on, it's still being framed in this kind of almost antiquated frame of like, well, who's the true conservative? Who's the rhino? Who's the crypto Democrat or whatever? Yeah. And in some ways, we wrote about this and maybe we talked about this recently, 10 years ago, that almost would have made sense, right? In the sense that you could look at the two main candidates in a Republican primary for, a state house race, and you could see that you could look at the interest group alignment behind them, and you'd have basically what's usually a very, a solidly conservative, across any classical kind of measures of conservative incumbent member being portrayed as anything but by someone challenging them from, further on the right.
Right.
And at this point, and that described, I would say, honestly, that described most competitive races in the primary. That was a pretty good shorthand. There's occasionally there'd be like a member who left a seat and came back or whatever.
Or there's local dynamics that don't get picked up. Or
so-and-so has had a long running dispute with, the county commissioner. Right. Now that blah, blah, blah. Right. Sure. Politics, local, that stuff happens. But those were the edge cases. Whereas now, when you say, okay, this incumbent's being challenged by this challenger, and you say, well, Abbott's on one side, Paxton's on the other, Trump is, kind of like, both of them are claiming that they're Trump's candidate. Right. And really, ultimately, we're talking about, if you think about the output of the legislature in the last few sessions, extremely conservative members by any measure. It's not like these members were not voting for the most conservative policy measures. But all of a sudden, the term just has, I wouldn't say the term necessarily, I don't know. I don't know if I want to say it this way. I'll say it, and then maybe I'll say it. Either the term has less meaning now, or it's just so difficult to discern.
Well, and one of the things we were writing, and I don't remember if I edited it out or not recently, I think the more focused piece on the website from a few days ago, I kept wanting to talk about the destabilization of the meaning of conservatism, and what resonates as conservative. And, there's a lot of kind of conventional pieces to that, dare we say, the shift in the Overton window in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. But, what we sort of have referred to in various kind of linguistic and conceptual constructions as, the expansion of the realm of legitimate discourse in the Republican Party in a rightward direction. Yeah. Right. So I think, and I'm kind of mindful of that because I think there are some of these races where, the person being derided as a rhino in some of the extreme cases here, the challenge to say people like Briscoe Cain and Jared Patterson, you got to really question whether by any, if you could come up with any kind of objective measure, the people challenging them are particularly more conservative than those candidates. So those cases exist. But I do think that in some of these cases, people that were candidates and that are now incumbents that were the most incumbent person in their prime, the most conservative by any kind of reasonable measure of whether it's ratings or voting records or pronouncements, were arguably, at the rightward edge of the spectrum in that race. They haven't moved, but to some degree, the window has moved a little. Yeah. And in some ways, a lot. And that doesn't automatically mean that they're being challenged by somebody more conservative, but it does create whatever you want to call it, the cognitive space, the political imaginary, where, a different way that I would put what you put, without disagreeing with your characterization of those races, but what I would say is 10 years ago, in a lot of these races, we couldn't have really conceived of a candidate that would be viable at all that was more conservative than those people that were staked out on what was then the far right end. Now we can.
Yeah. No, and,
Right?
and I mean, and it could be as simple
And whether
as,
they are or not, that still provides grist for somebody saying, well, this person is not conservative enough. When
Right,
people are like, well, yeah, I guess we could,
and
move
honestly,
into actually coming up with criminal penalties for women who get abortions.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, that's
a bad example because it's
no,
so
but
sweet, but it's not a terrible
No, but here,
one.
some less hypothetical examples, and this sort of reach, to the point, right? Which is, it's like, well, yes, that's true, but did you vote to impeach Ken Paxton? Well, then maybe you're not a conservative. Did you vote against, the voucher, piece of the education? Well, then maybe you're not a conservative. But I mean, there's some other stuff that's kind of floating around out there that I can't help but think about, which is like, do you think that the state party should, put out a statement that says that we shouldn't associate with Nazis?
Right.
Now, that's an example of, the expansion of the discourse, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
And I think that's sort of, I mean, I don't want to say that, race and demographic change shoot through all of this, but we've written a lot about that. So it's a big
Oh, yeah,
factor
but
here.
it's crazy to not,
And and it cuts through, I think, in a way that's not as I would say it's not as traditionally ideological as people tend to think. I'm sort of thinking back to, if you go and you read Milton Friedman talking about, sort of the conservative approach to sort of, racial integration and equality and things like, I mean, and all, whether you agree with that kind of stuff or not, it was a part of the discourse.
Well, and that goes to the earlier point, right? That and in Texas, it was part of the discourse in it was very close to the surface in a lot of discussions.
Yeah, but the thing was, and I would say going back to this 10-year, I mean, it was much closer to the surface in a very different way 10 years ago, right? I mean, in some ways, you think about the Rick Perry, snafu, right? In saying, basically saying that if you don't care about, these dreamers, these kids go to college, you don't have a heart, and the idea that the fact that sort of was a part of one of the death knells for him, at the time was kind of surprising, but it was evident why that would be the case going forward. Yeah. But the idea that you could imagine anyone in Texas staking out anything close to a similar position at this point, despite the fact that the state's demographics have continued the trend in the same direction, it's, it is a remarkable shift in the tone, but it also speaks to the idea that, ideology is hard to peg down because it's not a left-right thing, and you can kind of turn it depending on who's talking and whether they have the resources to make that message, I would say central.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have it right in front of me. I would be interested, it would be actually, this is a good idea for something to kind of parse out, to pick a few of these things and go back and look at what some of these attitudes look like pre-Trump. The discrimination, how much of things, where have things changed and where were they just bubbling under and nobody was exploiting them? And that is, I think at the end of the day where, if we're going to talk about Trump's impact, Trump has, this has become a cliched point now, I'm afraid, but I think, Trump not, I think the cliched part is, Trump said things out loud that Republicans were maybe a little bit reticent to say out loud, even in primaries, particularly around the kind of issues you're talking about. Cultural nationalism, race.
I mean, look, I just have to mention it because it's the most obvious sort of prominent recent example. I mean, the governor's comments about how, we're not shooting people crossing the border because the federal government would give us a hard,
would
charge us with murder.
Yeah.
I mean, look, whether that was, a slip up, whether that was, let's say an ill-considered way to say it, whether that was what was truly in his heart, I don't know. I never will, right? But that's not the sort of comment that I think a politician, a statewide, politician, a governor would have ever considered saying, 10 years ago. But it's sort of, but not only is it sort of, I'm not going to say it's acceptable, but I mean, the blowback, such as it is for someone like Abbott on this, is actually relatively minimal. Not only because it's not a re-election.
Here it was maybe a news cycle.
It was a news cycle, and the truth is,
I'm not even sure that ultimately it's even fair to say he suffered any blowback. He got a little bit of negative coverage, that got even some national play.
Yeah,
I think that's a great. I think that I agree. That is a great example of the degree to which Trump basically was able to liberate things that were there and gave people permission, And again, I would go back to my earlier point, and I think that is, it's been a multiplier in Texas in terms of the degree to which, those streams of thought and those attitudes have been around for a long time, right? And have been, ever present in conservative politics in the state. But they've gotten a boost from Trump, and I think that goes, as we're getting close to the 50-minute mark here. I mean, I think that one of the things then, to kind of think about with that is that, to your question of, well, where's the Republican Party going to be if Trump is convicted and, I don't think this is going to happen, but he's, if he's convicted and the bottom drops out of his support, and I'm not convinced that that would be the outcome, or, he loses enough support that he then loses and he's maybe at least politically discredited among elites. Where does that leave the party? I don't look now and see where the energy would be in the base.
Yeah.
To move the party, to edge the party back toward the center. And I don't mean to the center, but just in that direction,
Yeah. Well,
I just don't. We may find out in some other work we're doing. Maybe some of the people that have just been hunkering down and taking the long view and waiting for the fever to pass will go, well, this took longer than I had hoped, but now I'll poke my head above the hedges. But I don't know that there's enough of the rubber band snapping back to enable that kind of behavior. And I don't look around the Republican Party and see a lot of good candidates for leading it, at least at this point. Now, they're all laying low, so why would I? But
yeah, the only thing I would put as a potential sort of counterpoint on that, I don't disagree with it in the main, would just be to point out that, in the last election cycle that Trump was on the ballot in Texas, a lot of candidates outperformed him.
Yeah.
And a lot of candidates, especially in the most populous areas of the state, outperformed him. Now, this is obviously a reflection of both, Republican voters, but also some independents, maybe some Democrats in some of these areas. And so, there is evidence that, how could John, we've talked a lot about John Cornyn in Republican politics and say the fact that, he sort of has this, kind of middling position with Texas Republicans, and yet he outperformed Trump, in a number of places, on that ballot with a very different style of politics. So now look, do I think John Cornyn is the vehicle for, the post-Trump Republican era? I will say no. But I do. But
look,
think
he could be, he could be Senate Majority Leader.
He could be Senate Majority Leader.
I don't think he's the leading, but he's a contender.
There's a lot of things that have to happen between now and then. But I do think that if someone wants to say, well, is there evidence, for some desire for I'll just put it like a more traditional GOP brand than the one that Republicans that has been dominated by Trump, in the last 8 years. It's possible. Right, but the other thing is as we talk about all the time is I think most elected officials can't see past their nose because there's no reason to, and so really what it comes down to is what matters right now in this election cycle, and so long as Trump remains the force that he remains, it puts it puts most Republican elected officials in a somewhat difficult position if the question is, well, what's the Republican Party going to look like next?
Well, it makes it hard to judge because it's. We talked again about the political imagination earlier. It's really hard to imagine what the actual dynamics are if there's a vacuum where Trump was. Some Trump-like people obviously try to fill it, but it's part of, to put your, to touch on your point about the time horizons of most elected officials and put it slightly different. There are a lot of people that, and I know this from talking to having conversations with some Republican officials that are pretty clearly just, completely instrumental about this. Mm-hmm. People that, very loudly support Trump, but that besides going, so I wonder when this is going to be over and I can do something else.
Yeah.
There's still the question of what that something else is. But I think, to your point, that sentiment is out there. But I guess, in a more precise way, I wonder, so if Trump is gone, what is the lag if the base is going to shift direction and orientation, to some degree that will be led by elites. To some degree, it will just be the mysteries of, how people interpret the world and what their politics look like. What does the lag look like if that is going to happen? And I think the lag is probably pretty significant and creates a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurs to try to fill that Trumpish space.
Yeah, and I'll just put just one piece of meat on that. The lag is going to be significant because the primary dynamic here, the primary elections in Texas, are still going to be low turnout affairs where whoever is sort of the most activated in the party is still going to drive the process.
Right. And
so long as those are MAGA, I put like quotes, MAGA Republicans, well then that's going to be the tone of the candidates.
Well, that goes. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the point we made earlier, which is that those forces that are dominant and have become more powerful in the Republican Party as an organization have been there for a long time and are pretty well entrenched and are not likely to shift significantly after this. Now, the outcomes of some of those fights could be different, but Yeah,
you don't think they're going to say, well, Trump's gone, he lost, let's say he loses, and you're going to go, this isn't working. We're gonna take our power and give it back to you guys and go home. Right. Here you go, Chamber of Commerce.
Or we're going to decide that all these things that we felt were important and we identify with, we're not going to identify with anymore. And I just don't. I don't see much chance of that. So, all right, with that, good chat.
That was fun.
I want to thank Josh for being here. I want to thank, as always, our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Point you again to texaspolitics.utexas.edu, where you can find the data that we've talked about. If you're finding this podcast on one of the excellent podcast platforms that carry us, you will... If you go to the website to where we embed the podcast, you'll find supplemental material, links we've mentioned, data we've mentioned. So thank you for listening. If you're in Texas, enjoy the break and the weather. And we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.